Joining me now is Tony Schaefer. He is a retired lieutenant colonel. He is advising producer on National Geographic and a Trump 2020 advisory board member. So Tony, thank you for joining me. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks. I don't know if you remember, you and I were years ago on together on MSNBC when you sat in for Dylan Ratigan. It was a long time ago.
Sounds good. Well, good to be back together then. So let me ask you first, did you like the president's State of the Union?
I did. I think it was a mixture of a number of things which I think were important. He actually talked about social issues such as drug prices, trying to find a way to bring medical prices, costs down, as well as, and my primary focus area is national security. I think he said a number of very key things regarding NATO, regarding going forward regarding North Korea, and more importantly, in many ways, trying to find a way to make sure we end the conflict in Afghanistan. I'm one of those who believes we should have been in and out of there. I wrote a book about it called Operation Dark Heart back in 2010. And I think he's doing other things which relate directly to trying to strengthen the economy. And my belief is the stronger the economy is, the more everyone benefits, no matter where you are in the social stratus.
Okay, so I want to talk about drugs in a second where we disagree. Sure. But I'm fascinated by our agreement here on Afghanistan. Yeah. So look, that's a thing that we praised Trump for last night because we're fair, and we've been there now. Wow, 18 years.
Way too long.
Yeah.
Way too long. Right.
And so, what's your take on that? Why do you think we should leave Afghanistan?
Well, two things. First, every great empire has gone there to die. That's the nickname. It's the place where empires go to die. There's nothing there for us. The people who live there are not fundamentally ungoverned. They're self-governed. They're very much tribal. Most men who are born there live and die never moving more than 5 miles from where they're born, and they can't count past 20. So we have no interest in trying to make them us. The issue regarding the Taliban versus the Afghan government, they're all Pashtun. It's time for them to figure out their differences and work together to come to some peaceful resolution. That's not our job. One of the things I will say, I'd like to believe you'll agree with me, we've long since met the requirements of the authorized use of military force. Everybody who participated in the 9/11 attacks have either been killed or captured. And with that said, I think it's time for us to refocus on what's important, and us continuing to slug it out with essentially a regional threat. It's not in our interest.
Yeah, so there's something really interesting going on in the country, which I have not really seen in over 20 years of covering politics, which is that some portions of the right wing and the left wing are beginning to unite in a way that is unprecedented against the establishment, because the establishment has always been united, pro-war, pro-bankers, and I could go on, right? And so if you're a TV pundit, you love wars and you never think that there's a good time to leave. But big portions of the right and the left are now saying, what are we doing there? I mean, if we couldn't do it in 18 years, what are we going to take is another 18 months going to make a difference? Of course not. There was a poll in Afghanistan where they asked people that we were fighting in the valleys, why do you think the Americans are here? And over 90% of them had never heard of 9/11. They'd never even heard of it.
Exactly. And there's nothing to be gained by us remaining there and trying to slug it out with, again, a regional threat. And you might be surprised. I do spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and I think, yeah, to your point, you'd be surprised the meetings I walk into regarding who from the left and who from the right are sitting together talking about this issue. And I think, if nothing else, President Trump has actually allowed for free thinking and those who actually are predisposed to being critical of the establishment to have that space and time to do it. So I think this has been a very positive effect, and it'll continue.
Yeah. All right. Now let's have fun and move on to things we disagree on.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. So the opioid crisis, disastrous. Obviously, we agree on that. But in terms of the proposed solutions, Donald Trump said during the campaign that it was ridiculous that we're not negotiating drug prices on behalf of the government, and actually, the overwhelming majority of the American people obviously believe that because it's ridiculous. But Trump, like Obama and Bush, I could say it this way, sold us out and didn't do anything about it. So isn't that a huge problem that he hasn't actually done the one thing that would be most helpful in lowering drug prices?
Well, he did talk about it last night, and I think to your point, there's a lot of policy and infrastructure issues, I guess he has to deal with. And I'm not giving him a buy on this. I agree with you. This is something the president has to now focus on regarding what's best for the American people. And yeah, when we have drugs manufactured here in this country and yet they're sold in other countries for less, there's something really wrong with that. And this is going to have to be something that we actually do look at for regulation. I am not for overwhelming government regulation of any industry. With that said, I think the pharmaceutical industry has taken advantage of the American people far too long. And I think we've had a medical establishment, doctors and others who are more than happy to go along with it. And insurance companies are more than happy to pass the heartache on to us as a consumer. So this is something I'd like to believe the president now will focus on, and will use the full weight and measure of the Oval Office to try to resolve this.
Yeah, I can guarantee you that he won't.
Well, I'm hoping.
Yeah, well, but look, your underlying philosophy on it, again, shockingly, I totally agree. And it's because the drug companies captured the U.S. government. It's right. It's the corruption. And they've captured the Republicans, they've captured the Democrats. They're the #1 donors. We got to get the money out. If you don't get, yes. If you have privately financed elections, they're going to serve private interests. It's the most obvious thing in the world. The only people who won't recognize it are the politicians in Washington and the pundits on television. Right. So now I want to talk about another part that he mentioned in regards to the opioid crisis, the wall. Right. Now, again, Tony, that seems absurd to me. Are there some drugs coming into the country across the border? Yes. Is it mainly opioids? No, no way. Is that the main reason for the opioid problem in America? No, we all know it's the pharmaceutical companies, and whether it's actually those OxyContin, et cetera, that's causing the deaths, or people getting hooked on it and then going on to heroin. So do you agree with me that the wall wouldn't do much to help in that regard?
I think the physical barrier is something we need, because it's not only about drugs. It's about human trafficking. It's about essentially not being able to control our own borders. You and I may disagree on the issue of commerce regarding why it's important, but I think we should be having a number of crossings which we control. But I'll say this, and I'd like to see that we agree on this or not. I agree with you on the pharmaceutical companies. They do everything they can to get people on OxyContin and get them hooked. What happens then is that the cartels have been very smart about finding ways to get into treatment centers and other areas where they can actually offer up their drugs. In one case, I was briefed recently in the Pentagon by one of the seniors there about how these drug groups are actually taking advantage of the market that the U.S. drug makers create, and they go through the border to do it. Black tar heroin. They find ways to get heroin in, for example, as a less expensive substitute to opioids. So I can't say for certain that we will stop all drug activities if we build a wall. I've worked the counter drug thing back in the 90s. Back in the 90s, the big issue was the transit zone, which was the maritime transit zone from South America, Latin America up to Florida, Texas, and California. Obviously, when we got on that, they moved and changed their techniques. Now it's mostly land-based. So I do believe that we have to have some barrier, and that the cartels have figured out a way to exploit the open door that legal drug makers have made for them to come in and say, hey, we'll give you a cheaper product and get you hooked on that.
Yeah, so look, first of all, like I said, I believe that some are coming through the border. The overwhelming majority are already here. But for the ones that are coming through, as we see in the El Chapo trial, et cetera, it's mainly through tunnels. And we'd still have that same problem if we had a wall.
I'm one of those, this may be controversial. I actually proposed back in the 90s that we treat Mexico like an enemy area. We, as a military intelligence officer, we do something called intelligence preparation of the battle space, where we analyze terrain, infrastructure, social, cultural issues, and you basically map it out, and you figure out the likelihood of how someone will bypass certain measures. And I agree with you, the tunnels are a problem, and you will continue as long as there's money out there to be had, people building tunnels to get around the barrier. But with that said, I still think we had to have some level of unified barrier along the southwest border as a start point.
Okay, and let me just end on this because we're short on time.
Sure.
And of course, I don't agree that we should treat Mexico as enemy territory.
I know. I'm just saying.
Right, okay, just to be clear. All right, but look, there's also the demagoguery, in my opinion, that Trump did in regards to the undocumented immigrants. So you can always point out one case or multiple cases of crimes that any group does, but for example, MS-13 is horrible, despicable, and they're significant. There's 10,000 of them in the country, according to the best estimates. But Aryan Brotherhood, there's 20,000 of them, and I could show you just as despicable crimes, etc. And undocumented immigrants, on average, commit far less crime than natural-born citizens. So isn't that a little bit of fear-mongering?
No, look, there's an aspect that he didn't bring up, which was how within the immigrant communities, these communities are actually terrorized by other members of the criminal element. MS-13 is so effective because it actually does terrorize other illegal aliens. So, while on the surface of it, you may think that, okay, everybody's here and you have less crime. The crime that does exist actually is concentrated within those communities because, for better or for worse, illegal immigrants are not predisposed to go to law enforcement, and therefore the criminal elements within the illegal community exploit that. So what you see is a eviscerating community, and MS-13 has been very effective. Heck, I'm here in New York City. Just a few miles from me, there was an MS-13 assassination, I think, 2 days ago. So MS-13 is more brutal, I would argue, than the Aryan Brotherhood because they are emboldened within the environment they're now existing. So I think that's why we do have to deal with MS-13 and some of the illegal alien issues as quick as possible.
Right. Well, Aryan Brotherhood drills holes in people's heads, etc. They're both terrible. Yes. I think we can both acknowledge that. Yeah, and I want to go to show graphic one real quick for the sake of the audience, because Tony, I think, did acknowledge there that that undocumented immigrants do commit less crime on average. So you can just take a look at this: all crimes, homicide, etc. You get a sense there of the real picture in the country. But Tony, look, it was a really great conversation. Because there's plenty that we disagree on, but it turns out plenty that we do agree on. And so I want to thank you for coming on and having that conversation.
Well, I'd like to do it again sometime. I'd like to continue the debates. Good discussion.
All right, sounds great. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, retired now, and advising producer on Nat Geo, and yes, on Trump's advisory board for 2020.